The iPhone 13 is dead. Or rather, more accurately, Apple is no longer selling it brand new, as the iPhone 13 has been officially discontinued, with the iPhone 14 slotting into its former place at $600 within Apple's lineup. But discontinuation of the iPhone 13 doesn't have quite the same ring as the death of the iPhone 13, so we'll go with the latter, I think. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and clickbait aside, I do think it's worth discussing the iPhone 13 as a whole and where it stands 3 years later. This was and still is a very great iPhone, and perhaps the final truly great non-Pro iPhone, at least compared to what we've had since. In fact, the iPhone 13 is practically identical to the iPhone 14 that is still being sold. The only notable differences being the extra 2 gigs of RAM in the 14, as well as an extra GPU core. I'm not kidding, that's pretty much it. Basically, the iPhone 14 was the same phone as the 13, but a little faster and more expensive. It was likely the worst iPhone upgrade I think we've seen in years, if not ever, and having a Plus model instead of a Mini option wasn't something I've ever particularly been excited about. See, the thing is, back in the day you had the 13 Mini, the 13, then the 13 Pro, and the 13 Pro Max. Yes, you had to pay quite a lot if you wanted the biggest option. However, there were still 3 size options. Now there's only 2. Sure, you can get the Plus size for a bit cheaper than the Pro Max, but overall there's less choice for the consumer. Of course, the 13 Mini was discontinued last year with the iPhone 15 launch, which I at the time found very disappointing, and unfortunately we've still seen no replacement for those mini iPhones, with instead the Plus models sticking around. In fact, there's now 3 Plus iPhone models being sold within Apple's lineup, plus the Pro Max if you want to count that, and it all feels very redundant and unnecessary. I don't think the 14 Plus or the 15 Plus were selling too well to begin with, and now there's 3 options in the mix. Don't fully get that, but oh well, at least the choice is there for those who might be interested. Still though, the iPhone 13 was really a solid phone, as was the 13 Mini. The iPhone 12 and 12 Mini from 2020 had themselves been impressive devices, especially coming from the iPhone 11. Not only was there 5G now, but we had OLED screens, which meant far more vibrant colors with true blacks. And we also saw significantly reduced bezel sizes and a full new design with those flat edges that have been around ever since. Coming off that, it would have made sense for the iPhone 13 to feel like a significantly lesser upgrade, and while cosmetically it technically was, I would argue that it still really lived up to the hype. First off, and most importantly truly, the cameras were switched from vertically aligned on the 12 to diagonally aligned. 10 out of 10 feature, thank you Apple, very cool. And look, you guys have now switched them back to how they were with the iPhone 16, wow. It's for spatial video for the Vision Pro, but still, it's funny to me. But honestly, I don't hate it. It does offer easy differentiation between the iPhone models, as well as a certain freshness to the new device, even if the change is still fairly meaningless. A far more meaningful change was the increased battery life on the 13, and especially the 13 Mini, with the 13 having 19 hours of video playback compared to 17 on the 12, and then the 13 Mini now having 17 hours compared to 15 on the 12 Mini. This now meant that the very small iPhone 13 Mini had the same battery life as the 6.1-inch iPhone 12, and while 2 hours might not sound like a whole lot of difference, this is specifically for a video playback benchmark. That sort of thing can extend further depending on what you're doing with your phone. It's a pretty stark difference, and it made the battery in the iPhone 13 Mini actually quite decent, at least when it was first purchased. That can definitely change over time as the health degrades of course, but still, any small phone having even half decent battery life deserves some modicum of recognition in my mind. The 12 Mini had been borderline acceptable, but that 13 Mini really did improve on it. For other changes, the 13 and 13 Mini brought a new slew of colors, and I think they were all pretty gorgeous. Nothing too out of the norm here. From the front though, the iPhone 13 and 13 Mini shrunk down the notch by about 20%, and that might sound fairly inconsequential, but it does look significantly smaller, something especially beneficial on the iPhone 13 Mini. It, being a smaller device, makes the notch feel more intrusive and larger than it does on bigger phones, so going from the 12 Mini to the 13 Mini, the latter absolutely looked far better from the front, and the iPhone 13 looked fantastic as well. Obviously, the next year's iPhone 14 and 14 Plus didn't bother changing the notch further, nor the back camera orientation. The 14 Pro, on the other hand, did bring the dynamic island, and that would also hit the iPhone 15 non-Pro the next year. So all this does really help the iPhone 13, I think, feel more modern, looking cosmetically identical to the next year's device, and one still being sold for $600 or $700 from Apple, which is a lot of money. The 13 Mini has been gone for a year now, so it's pretty difficult to find the device still available from any carriers or retailers, but the bigger 13, now just having been discontinued, will likely start to go on clearance as stores and carriers clear out their remaining inventory. If you want a solid, more budget level iPhone, the 13 I think is still fantastic, and if you're buying buying it brand new, you don't have to worry about the battery health, which will often be the main concern if you're going to the secondhand market where the phone could have been used for upwards of 3 years. That being said, the used market like Facebook Marketplace or eBay.com can also be an enticing option in terms of finding a good deal on an iPhone like this. Because the 14 was such a small upgrade, the phone has held up a lot better than it would have otherwise, comparatively speaking, though the extra 2 gigs of RAM in the iPhone 14 is definitely helpful, with the 13 only having 4 gigs itself. Thankfully, iOS is still very well optimized, so it shouldn't be too much of an issue yet. You might have less apps stay open in the background, but in the future, to be clear, it could be a bit of a hindrance, and there's a good chance the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus do get at least an extra year of software support. But considering Apple's current pattern of updating their iPhones with the XR and XS from 2018 still fully supported on iOS 18, you've probably got a good few years with the iPhone 13 left, even if you'll miss out on some potential features like the fancy Apple Intelligence stuff that's exclusive to the iPhone 15 Pro, as well as the 16 and 16 Pro. But honestly, for me at least, that really doesn't matter a whole lot. Apple Intelligence feels more like a marketable gimmick than a genuinely useful feature set, but hopefully Apple will prove me wrong once it's all officially out. The iPhone 13 and 13 mini were in many ways almost classical iPhone upgrades, furthering the design of the iPhone 12 and 12 mini in all the right ways while bringing truly solid value for money. The phones are still very similar to non-Pro iPhones today, even right down to the lack of ProMotion, which is something still only seen on the Pro iPhones beginning with the 13 Pro. And for a while that made sense. In 2021, the 13 mini, 13 and 13 Pro, as well as the 13 Pro Max, all felt, to me at least, like a truly balanced, fair lineup. One of the strongest in recent years, to be sure. But time must go on, and with the 13 mini discontinued in 2023, it was only inevitable the larger 13 would follow suit. I do think it's a pity that these genuinely substantial iPhone upgrades that we saw in previous years really just don't seem to happen anymore. Sure, the iPhone 15 brought the Dynamic Island and USB-C, but aside from that, the 14, 14 Plus, 15, 15 Plus, and finally 16 and 16 Plus are all very similar devices, with little upside going for the pricier models. The 16 and 16 Plus still having 60Hz in 2024 is brutal, but on the iPhone 13, it wasn't so bad, especially since the 13 Pro had only just gotten it. And 60Hz, it's one of those things a lot of people just don't care about. I do think ProMotion should be on the 16 and 16 Plus, given how expensive they are. Everywhere else in the smartphone market at that price point, you're getting 120Hz, so it's pretty silly Apple's not doing that. But still, the iPhone 13 has held up really well, and if anything, it's actually held up better since the 16 and 16 Plus aren't getting that feature, making the 13 and 13 mini even more similar to those phones than they would be anyways. These really were good phones that at $700 for the mini and $800 for the 6.1-inch model felt fairly priced, at least to me at the time. The value is further helped by the fact that the iPhone 13 came with 128 gigabytes instead of only 64 on the iPhone 12. The same number that Apple is still using for their base models of iPhones, including the $1,000 iPhone 16 Pro. That is absurd that they're still doing that, but again, it's one of those things that lends the iPhone 13 feeling more modern. I think it even feels more up to date than it probably should. The non-Pro iPhones just haven't done a whole lot to differentiate themselves from these devices. The iPhone 14 the next year not having the A16 chipset, but instead the A15, the one in the 13 Pro, not the iPhone 13, which again was one GPU core different. Who cares? These are such negligible changes, and it makes, again, the iPhone 13 hold up better. It makes it far more appealing in 2024 and beyond than it probably should be, considering its age. I definitely think they've got a long life ahead of them in terms of updates as well as user base. I know plenty of people still happily using their iPhone 13 and 13 minis, and particularly with that mini, there's really no new iPhone that feels like an ideal upgrade if you're someone who prefers the smaller form factor. It's sort of wild just how much Apple's iPhone landscape has changed in just a few years, and how much worse off it feels to me. It feels so cheap on their part and money grubby, and while Apple has always been like that to an extent, I don't know, it just feels worse than it did in past years, if that makes any sense. The iPhone 13 and 13 mini felt like legitimately great smartphones that even offered an upgrade for users who might come from the iPhone 12. And while nobody should be buying a new smartphone every year, I do think it's important for phones to bring enough to the table in a yearly upgrade to make the new model be even worth existing in the first place. Apple wants you to upgrade every year, ideally. They'll advertise the trade-in numbers for the most recent iPhones, hoping you'll trade it in for their newest model. If you're going to do that, you should be getting a phone that feels substantially better. And I think with the iPhone 12 to the 13, that was the case, but from the 15 to the 16, not a chance. This has been an issue for a while, the iPhone 14 being a whole number higher than the 13, 13 may give the impression that it's somehow significantly different and better. After all, going from the 10R to the 11, then the 11 to the 12, and the 12 to the 13 all did manage to achieve that in their own ways, being better. But the 14 was practically the exact same as the 13, and while that's fine to some extent because the 13 was a fantastic phone, I do have to wonder if the 14 brought enough to the table to even justify its existence. A Plus model is nothing special. That had already been available with the 13 Pro Max, and sure, it was more expensive, but at least it was still there. And now there is no mini option. You can't even pay extra for it. It feels like Apple has deserted that niche but dedicated group of users who just love their small phones. And even with the larger 13, we just haven't seen an upgrade on the same level in the years since. Maybe it all just doesn't matter much in the grand scheme of things, but hey, I think the iPhone 13 and 13 mini deserve some credit as pretty great iPhones, and devices that have been now fully forgotten by Apple, outside of maybe the iPhone 13 showing up on their refurbished section at some point. Again, carriers also might carry the 13 for a little longer, perhaps on clearance, and that might be worth looking into. But for now, I think I'm right about done here. If you want some more of my thoughts on Apple and iPhones as a whole, I recently did a totally definitely brief 2-hour retrospective on when iPhone peaked and how things are maybe going downhill. I'll link that video in the description for anyone interested. But I'm curious, how many of you are still using the iPhone 13 or the 13 mini? How's it working for you? Make sure you leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing if you haven't already. Huge shout out to the channel members for being absolutely amazing people. Thank you so much, and thank you all so much for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.